Invite you tonight to turn to Ecclesiastes chapter 4. That'll be the text for our lesson this evening. Ecclesiastes chapter 4. Have just a bit of a review before we get into this chapter. He begins the book of Ecclesiastes, all is vanity. Of course, that means nothing really amounts to anything, doesn't it? And it sounds like a very bleak way to begin this book. But you got to remember, it's all is vanity under the sun. Now, that has to do with just things of this earth. If you take spiritual things out of the picture, you take God out of the picture, all is vanity. He goes on like this till he gets down to the end of chapter 2, and that's where he begins to talk about God. And then immediately in chapter 3, he says there is a purpose for everything. And so when God is brought back into the picture, now we begin to see purpose. I want you to remember that as we start looking at what's going to happen next. He's going to be talking about observations of life. And you see how it changed from all being vanity without God, and then there being purpose for things with God. And as we look at these observations that the preacher has of things he has seen in life, just kind of apply those two scenarios to it. What if there's no God? Or what if God doesn't matter? What if things just pertain to this life? And look at this picture. And then look how the picture changes when you bring God into the matter. There's an old country music song. I want to see hands. I wonder, am I the only old soul in here that remembers Hank Williams singing a picture from life's other side? Do you remember that old? Good, I see several that know that, but I tell you, some of us up in years that remember that. I don't think that song has been a hit lately, but there were several that sang it, but none like old Hank did, that mournful song. And what it is, it's a song about how that there's a great hall where you go see the pictures of life. And he walks in there and he sees all these joyful pictures down along this wall, but he gets on further down and rounds the corner and he sees the pictures of life's other side. And it's just one mournful scene after another till you get to the end of the song, and the whole song's really depressing. And so it's a good one for Hank Williams to sing, because he can sing it that way. But that's sort of what we have here. We're going to look at the preacher looking at life, and it's almost as though we see pictures of life's other side. Here are the 6 pictures we're going to look at. The first one we're not going to spend much time on because we discussed that when we looked at Ecclesiastes chapter 3. But the preacher had looked and he had seen how beasts die. And then he looks and says, well, look how man dies. It looks like man dies just like the beast died. This isn't the whole picture, but here's the part of it that's the gist of it. A man hath no preeminence above a beast, for all is vanity. All go to one place. All are of the dust. All return to dust again. Who knoweth the spirit of man that goeth upward, and the spirit of beast that goeth downward to the earth? Now, if you take that passage out of context, you can come up with some very strange ideas. And that's an idea a lot of people teach in our public school system and all, and they're talking about evolution, and we're just all evolved beasts, and there's nothing, man has no preeminence above a beast. But we know that's wrong, don't we? You change God and you put God in that picture and the whole thing changes. And Solomon knew that, because at the end of the book, he's going to talk about how the body returns to the earth from which it came, but the spirit returns unto God who gave it. So Solomon knew, but he knew that by revelation, and God had shown that to man. And so that's the kind of way we're going to look at these pictures. This picture that begins in Ecclesiastes 4, verses 1 through 3, is a very disturbing picture. And I'm sure all of us have seen something like this that is just disturbing and unsettling to us. It's the plight of the oppressed. So I returned and considered all the oppressions that are done under the sun. And behold, the tears of such as were oppressed. And they had no comforter. And on the side of their oppressors there was power, but they had no comforter. Wherefore I praise the dead which are already dead more than the living which are yet alive. Yea, better is he that both they which hath not been, who hath not seen the evil that is done under the sun. Now mark that, under the sun. If all we knew about life is what we could observe under the sun, what a bleak picture this would be. I see scenes on TV, and I'm not one that really watches the news, but I've seen a few clips of some of the things happening in Syria, and especially those pitiful children that are suffering in that, and they are oppressed, and there's no comforter. And how do you deal with that? And you have seen things like that too throughout your life, where there are those in power, and they are oppressing those that appear defenseless. And it's a disturbing scene. It is so disturbing that some people have looked at scenes like that and have decided that there is no God. Because how could God allow evil like this to continue? I had a lady I worked with come to me one day, and she was very mixed up. But she came to me and sat in front of my desk, and she told me, she says, I don't believe in God. And not only that, then she said this, I'm angry with God. Well, you know, how can that both be so? But she was really angry. She says, I don't believe. If I had children, she said, if I had children, I wouldn't let them act this way. And she's talking about the way that people were acting. It's as though she would know better than God on what to allow and what not to allow. So, see, God didn't meet her expectations and her standards, so she was angry with him and decided she wouldn't believe in him. And she thought she had a valid viewpoint. But let me tell you, God knows so much, much more than that lady I used to work with. That I'm glad she is not God, I'll tell you that. And I'm glad I have a God that is greater than she was. You take God out of the pictures of life, though, and you look at the troubles and the disturbing things in life, and if there is no God, it is a picture bleak indeed. Now, bring God into this picture. And look how the whole scene changes. Well, there's still those that are oppressed, and you still see their tears, but there is a comforter. And they may not experience the comfort that comes from that comforter, but let me tell you, God knows the plight of the widows and the orphans, and he knows the suffering of every one of us, and he loves us. And not only that, he came in the flesh and dwelt among us and suffered these oppressions himself, so that we would know that he is touched with the feelings of our infirmities. And in that there is comfort. And in that there is hope. And we learn, as we study about God in the Bible, we learn the sad truth that everything isn't fixed in this life, but this is not all. It's not all under the sun. And God is righteous. And we may not understand all his ways, but all remains in his power. And this is just life's little day. And there's an eternity that lies beyond the stars, and not just under the sun, beyond the stars. And God's going to take care of these things. And so we have a hope in the midst of these awful scenes that those who take God out of the picture do not have. And so they have nothing but despair. And so if anything, it would drive you to at least want to believe in God, doesn't it? And in fact, listen, we talk about good and evil, and there would not even be a standard of what was good and evil if there was no God. And so you see how the preacher here in Ecclesiastes, he's observing this and giving us some things to think about. If it's all under the sun, look how bleak this is. Let's look at the next picture. Next picture is a picture of a work ethic. And he's going to describe here 3 different work ethics that he has observed. Now the first one starts off pretty good. Again, I considered all travail. Now travail, listen, that is strenuous work. Remember when Adam was cast out of the garden? And he had to go to work. And that work was going to be hard. There were thorns and thistles in the way, and so he had very hard work to do. Well, I was considered all this travail and every right work. Now, here's a fella, he's out there working hard, and he's doing the right things, and the implication here is he prospers as a result of that. Now, wouldn't you be proud to see that? I mean, if your neighbor got out there and he was working hard and doing the right things and he prospered, would you be proud of your neighbor? Well, you know, here's what happens. You get a fellow like that, and this is what goes on. That this man is envied of his neighbor. Why, you would think folks would be proud of you. You get out and work hard and do the right things and you prosper, and yet instead of being proud of you and people praising you, there's a lot that are just going to envy you. I know a man in North Carolina that worked very hard, and he was very wise, and he prospered. And one thing that really just irritated him was the way that a lot who knew him would envy him. As though if they could, they would have deprived him from the pleasures that he enjoyed from his good work and good sense. And that bothered him. It bothered him really more than it should. I always told him he ought to be proud to be able to enjoy the blessings God gave him as a result of the work that he did. And he was a good man and a good giving man too. But a lot of time you get out and you do something, and what happens is find out your neighbors envy you. And so Solomon, looking at this, said, this is also vanity and vexation of spirit. But now here's the other work ethic. The fool, or the lazy man, and what does he do? Well, he folds his hands together and eats his own flesh. That means he just wastes away to nothing. He doesn't have anything. Why, you've seen people like that. They're so lazy and they have nothing. But then they haven't worked for anything. They haven't tried to get anything either. So you either get out and you work real hard and you're successful and people envy you, or you can sit back and just fold your hands and then just have nothing. Now, that doesn't sound like 2 very good choices, does it? But now here's a third way. He says, better is an handful with quietness than both the hands full with travail and vexation of spirit. I'll tell you, you've seen this too. People that work so hard, and they're always wanting more and more and more until they don't just get their portion, they get a double portion. They got both hands full, but they're not enjoying it. I mean, they are working at it and struggling with it, and they don't know how to enjoy what it is that they have. Now, it'd be better to have a handful, see, a sufficiency, and then be able to let the other hand rest. And God knew this. When he gave the 10 commandments, one of those commandments was to remember the Sabbath and keep it holy, and there also be no labor during that day. Men need to rest. And this idea of always, I'll work a little harder and I'll get a little more. Now, good work ought to be rewarded and you ought to be able to profit, but you can take this too far until all your work, while you're getting both hands full, you're getting no satisfaction out of it. It's better to have a balanced life and have your priorities straight and work hard at the right things, but then be able to have the time to rest and focus on the other things of life that bring life joys and pleasures as well. So there's the work ethic he's observed. Let's look at this next picture. Someone that labors for himself. I want you to see if someone comes to your mind, a fictional character I'm thinking of here. See if you'll know who I'm talking about when I say his name. Then I returned, and I saw vanity under the sun. There is one alone. There is not a second. Yea, he hath neither child nor brother. Yet is there no end of all his labor, neither is his eye satisfied with riches. Neither saith he, for whom do I labor and bereave my soul of all good? This also is vanity, yea, it is a sore travail. Does that remind you of someone? Now the person that comes to my mind was Ebenezer Scrooge. You remember how that movie begins? Why, he works. I tell you, he's always at that office before Bob Cratchit gets there and scolding him for not being there when he's there, and he's always wanting to stay later and counting that money, and he doesn't even want to take off for Christmas. But what's he getting out of it? He's all alone. He goes home to this big empty house and there's no one there, and he doesn't have anybody to leave this to, and his partner has died, and he's not even got a brother. He's just out there by himself, working, and not even stopping to ask, why am I doing this? Now, people can get caught up in that as well, isn't it? And get so caught up in working and obtaining things as though the whole of life is to just have more and more and more, without being able to enjoy it. And so he says, this is vanity, yea, it is a sore travail. Let's look at the next picture. Next picture I call two are better than one. Now as I read this, I want you to count the ways that he describes how two are better than one. Two are better than one because they have a good reward for their labor. For if they fall, the one will lift up his fellow. But woe unto him that is alone when he falleth, for he hath not another to help him up. Again, if two lie together, then they have heat. But how can one be warm alone? And if one prevail against him, two shall withstand him. And a threefold cord cannot be broken. It's hard to live life all alone, isn't it? If you're all by yourself and all alone, now life can get hard. You need to have somebody with you. Well, we think about this in marriage. Bible said it is not good that man should be alone. And so he made man a help that was suitable for him. That's what it means, a help meet for him. So he created a woman to help him. And then man and woman together, they're a lot happier. Now, you know, the statistics show that married men live longer. Did you know that? One old fella said, well, that's not really so, it just seems that way. But it's really so. Married men live longer because it's hard to live alone. But this isn't necessarily talking about marriage. If you're in a business, it's good to have a business partner. Now there are sole proprietors, but a lot of time people do better when they have a partnership. And two working together. I remember this study in management when they were having me manage personnel and such, and sent me all these courses thinking maybe I'd get good at this if they kept training me. They'd say, and they'd talk about this concept of synergy. And that is, you could measure the production of an individual, and then you could measure the production of another individual, and you put those two together, and the production is greater than than the both of them working alone when they work together. Like instead of 1 + 1 is 2, it'd be like 1 + 1 is a 2.8 advantage or something. You get more out of synergy. And so you just work better when you're working with someone. And then it says here, that's their good reward for their labor. And then if one fall, the other will lift up his fellow. But woe is to him that is alone when he falleth, he hath not another to help him up. And so we see that among the elderly, don't we? It's good to have someone around when you're elderly in case you fall. What are you going to do? Well, you have someone to be there to help you and help you along. And then it says this, if two lie together, then they have heat, but how can one be warm alone? You know, when I say 3 Dog Night, do you know what I'm talking about? A lot of people, they think that's a rock and roll band. But that expression was around a lot longer than rock and roll. I tell you, if you were cold at night what you could do, you get the dog in bed with you and you stay warm. And a real cold night called for 3 dogs. So that's an awful cold night, a 3-dog night. Well, but the same things applies with somebody else. If you go down that Overvilla Road and you see the old inn, the old stage inn, used to stop, that building's about to fall apart, but the stage would stop there. And if you ever look through those windows and look at that building, it's divided in two. There's one side and there's the other side. And that's because when the stage would stop, people would get off the stage and all the men would go to one side and all the women would go to the other side. But they all didn't have separate beds. They'd all sleep together. And the reason why, well, it'd get cold. And so you just sleep with your fellow travelers, and that's the way they used to do it. And so, again, 2 are better than 1. You can share things and do better together. And then it says here, if one prevail against him, 2 shall withstand him. Well, you got protection there. You know, it's not good sometimes to be out there places you just don't want to be alone. You want somebody with you because you're a lot safer when somebody's there with you. And then the 3-fold cord cannot be broken. And we've seen that where you take one line and maybe you could snap it, but you wrap 3 together and man, that is hard. And it speaks to the power of unity, doesn't it? And people coming together. Now people speculate, well, what's the 3rd cord there, the 3-fold cord? What's the 3rd? Some say, well, that's 2 men and 2 people and God with them. And that's true. That would be strong. But I'm not sure if we stress it that way or say, well, 2's good and 3's better. I'm not sure if we're stressing it too far to come up with that. It's simply illustrating the fact that it's hard to be alone, and you have others with you. You can be a lot stronger is what the real point being made there is. Okay, an observation of life. Let's look at the last one. The story of the old foolish king. Better is a poor and wise child than an old and foolish king who will no more be admonished. This old king, you can't tell him anything. He's beyond instruction. You know, they say you can't teach an old dog new tricks, and that's kind of like where this old king has gone. He's not going to learn anything. He's kind of set in his ways. Well, now, a poor wise child is better than an old foolish king that won't take any instruction and won't be admonished. Now, why is that? He says, for out of prison he cometh to reign, whereas also he that is born in his kingdom becometh poor. That poor wise child, he may wind up in prison, but he can get out of prison, and before long he is reigning in that kingdom. While the king's own son is disposed of power. Well, think about Joseph. You know, Joseph was a man that came out of prison and reigned second in command of all of Egypt. And I almost wonder if this couldn't have been Solomon talking about himself here. You know what happened to Solomon? There was this young man named Jeroboam. And Solomon and Jeroboam got crossed ways, and Jeroboam had to flee and go into Egypt, like his prison. And Rehoboam became king after Solomon died. But Rehoboam was not wise, he was foolish. And Jeroboam comes out of Egypt and winds up reigning in the stead of Rehoboam over the 10 tribes. It's almost as though Solomon could maybe see this coming as he talked about this. But then it goes on with this picture, and it says, I considered all the living which walk under the sun, with the second child that shall stand up in his stead. Now, who are we talking about there? Well, this might be a little hard to follow, but I'll tell you what I think. I think this is talking about the child of the wise child that became king, and now his son is coming up in his stead. That being the second child. Now, there's other ways to look at that, but look at that picture a minute. It says this, there is no end of all the people, even all that have been before them. They also that come after shall not rejoice in him. Surely this also is vanity and vexation of spirit. So what are we talking about here? Well, the old foolish king, he's not able to leave the kingdom to his son. This poor wise child winds up and he becomes king instead, but that old king becomes old too, and his son comes into power, and the people don't like him. And this change of power, you know, we see this played out really in our own political system, don't we? I don't remember the statistics, but it's very few times where someone is president for 8 years and then someone of their own party becomes elected president. That happens very few times in American history because people get tired of it being one way and they get to thinking another way will be better. And so there's this turnover of power, and it keeps changing back and forth. But you know, with all these changes, people still aren't satisfied. There's no end to the people. They keep coming, and then they don't rejoice. And the one that follows that, the dissatisfaction, then returns and sets in place. And so Solomon says, surely this also is vanity and vexation of spirit. Well, there's the 6 pictures, 6 observations of life. And if you look at life without God and you just see these things going on, and life can get really depressing. And so it's good to remember where Solomon is going with all of this. Fear God and keep His commandments. This is the whole duty of man. And you bring God into these pictures and these observations that Solomon sees, and you'll see a better picture than you see without Him. Now we've got some memory work, and this is for the Bible Bowl. And the memory verses are these. The fool foldeth his hands together and eateth his own flesh. Better is a handful with quietness than both hands full with travail and vexation of spirit. That handful's a sufficiency. When you think about what you need in life, think about this. Do you have a sufficiency? And this idea of godliness with contentment, it is great gain, Paul says. So we need to look at what we have. You know, we might think sometimes God blesses us by withholding from us some of the riches and pleasures of life because it would be more than we can take care of properly, more than we can handle, and we are wise to become satisfied with the sufficiency and enjoy that as a gift from God. Now, let's go to the invitation. If old Solomon was to observe your life, what would he see? Well, I observe your life. I'm a preacher, Solomon the preacher. I see some good things in your lives. I see some awful things in some people's lives. I see people that have some dire straits in this world, but when they're good people, and they have a God to cling to, and they have a character about them, and they take on these life struggles and realize, look, this is my task, and I'm going to do this, and I'm going to live a life that brings glory to God. Those lives are wonderful lives. But you take people, I don't care how well off they are, how well off they think they are. If they don't have God in their life is bleak, and I wouldn't have it. So, by way of invitation, I want you to take stock of your own life and stand back like Solomon did here. What if you could observe your own life, and what role does God have in your life? And if God is there, then you've got a worthwhile life, a life that has purpose to it. And by way of invitation, then, I want to invite you to obey the gospel of Christ if you haven't, and let your life be lived to the glory of God. If you need to do that, then do it as we stand and sing this invitation song.